They brought her in at midnight, barefoot, blood-stained, and bound with iron chains so thick they were normally used for violent men. 3 overseers struggled to control her trembling body as she stepped onto the rotting wooden steps of Blackthorn Plantation, yet she did not scream, did not plead, did not even blink. She simply stared, a deep, soul-scraping stare that made the strongest men lower their weapons. From that very first second, everyone felt it. This girl was not ordinary, and whatever she carried with her had followed them from a place far older than America itself. Her arrival split the night open like a curse. Dogs howled, horses kicked their stalls, lamps flickered as if a cold wind swept through the entire estate. The slaves watched from their quarters, whispering prayers, tracing symbols in the dirt. Some said she came from a forbidden line of priestesses. Others swore she spoke in tongues when the moon was high. But the bravest claimed something far stranger, that she wasn't supposed to be alive at all. The plantation master, Edward Blackthorn, had purchased her after hearing rumors of an abominable girl who killed her former owner. The story was unbelievable, yet the price he paid for her was even more shocking. He traded 3 prime field hands and a purebred horse just to claim her. His wife, Margaret, called it madness. His neighbors called it obsession. And the slaves, they simply kept quiet because they knew the old saying too well: some women are not bought. They arrive when fate decides it's time. From the moment she entered the house, the air changed. The walls seemed to breathe differently, the floorboards groaned under a new weight, and the mirrors fogged even when no one stood near them. Strange footprints appeared overnight. Candles melted into twisted shapes. The grand clock in the parlor stopped at 3:13 each night, never earlier, never later. Yet nothing terrified the household more than her silence. She never asked for food. She never asked for mercy. She never spoke her name. But her eyes, God above, her eyes were ancient, watching, calculating, waiting. Within weeks, men on the plantation began behaving strangely. Overseers argued less and obeyed her without knowing why. Young field hands woke up startled, claiming they saw her standing beside their beds in the dark, whispering to the shadows instead of them. Even Edward, once a proud, ruthless man, began showing signs of something unthinkable: devotion. It started small. He ordered better clothing for her. Then he instructed servants to let her roam the house freely. Soon, he was canceling town meetings, ignoring business, and wandering the halls at night, searching for her like a man possessed. The slaves said she was peeling the soul off him little by little. Margaret said she was poisoning him with witchcraft. But Edward didn't care. He couldn't. For reasons he couldn't explain, he needed her close. The turning point came on a storm-heavy night when screams erupted from Edward's study. Doors slammed, glass shattered, and when the servants burst inside, they found Edward lying on the floor, bleeding, dazed, whispering her name with a smile. She stood over him, expressionless, her hands clean although the room was wrecked. That same night, he signed a decree transferring full authority of household operations to her. And so the whispers began. A slave becoming the mistress. She bewitched him. That girl carries death in her shadow. Yet in the months that followed, the plantation flourished in ways no one understood. Crops doubled, livestock prospered. Rain never destroyed the fields. It curved away, as if repelled by an invisible boundary. Some saw miracles, others saw dark bargaining. But the truth was far stranger, because behind her eerie calm, behind her silent authority, behind her inexplicable rise, there was a secret buried deep beneath Blackthorn Plantation, one that tied her fate to every dying scream, every lost servant, every strange ritual carved into the house's bones. And when the full moon rose over the plantation for the 13th time since her arrival, everything that had been hidden began clawing its way into the light. From the moment she set foot on Blackthorn soil, the plantation seemed to react to her as if it recognized something in her that no human could understand. It wasn't just the trembling of the horses or the sudden hush among the slaves, it was the way the land itself shifted, the way the wind halted at her back as if afraid to touch her. People often say the world ignores the suffering of the enslaved, but in her case the world responded like a wounded animal, watching her every step. Those who looked at her too long claimed they saw something flicker behind her eyes, not quite human, not entirely spirit, but something caught between the living and whatever lies beyond. She moved quietly, but every silent motion carried the weight of a buried history. A history soaked in rituals, curses, forbidden oaths, and bloodlines whispered about only in fear. What no one understood then was that she didn't arrive at Blackthorn as a victim. She arrived as a consequence. Somewhere, miles away, an old debt had been collected. Somewhere, a chain of sins had snapped loose from its anchor. She walked into the plantation not like a girl purchased, but like a warning delivered. Edward Blackthorn thought he bought her, but men like him never understood that some souls cannot be owned. He paid in money, but the true price was spiritual, ancient, stitched into the shadows that followed her. From the night she was dragged in, the house reacted violently, bending to her presence like timber cracking under pressure. The walls groaned, windows trembled, and yet she remained unmoved, standing in the center of the storm like the eye itself. The slaves felt it first. They sensed the invisible pull around her, the way the air thickened near her, the way candles dimmed when she passed. Some refused to sleep inside the quarters when she roamed the yard. Others prayed louder, hoping their gods would protect them from whatever she carried. And yet, not a single one of them hated her. They feared her, yes, but it was the kind of fear reserved for something too powerful to disrespect. They watched her from a distance, trying to understand how a girl so thin, so silent, so young could command such an unnatural presence. Mothers pulled their children close when she walked by, not out of anger but out of respect. She was not someone they pitied. She was someone they recognized as touched by what none of them dared to say. Edward, however, saw something else entirely. He saw beauty where others saw danger. He saw calm where others sensed storms. And as he studied her, his fascination grew into something darker, an obsession he did not realize was poisoning his mind. At first he approached her with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned her fate. He spoke to her as if she were just another purchase. He expected fear in her eyes, but her silence unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. She never lowered her gaze. She never flinched. She simply stared as though she was reading parts of him he had never shown anyone. And then one night, after returning from town, he found her standing in the doorway of his library, illuminated only by the dying flame of a candle. She didn't speak, she didn't move, she only stared. He felt something inside him, something he had buried, break loose. From that moment, his authority began to unravel. He started waking at night, whispering her name. He started hearing footsteps that weren't there. He started imagining her presence in every room. The strange part was that his fear didn't push him away. It pulled him closer. He was a man who had whipped slaves without blinking, punished children without remorse, and burned down fields to assert control. Yet this silent girl stripped him of every layer of power with nothing but her stillness. He convinced himself he was enchanted, bewitched, manipulated. But the truth was far simpler and far more terrifying. She had exposed the rot within him, and he mistook that exposure for love. As Edward spiraled deeper into her orbit, Margaret Blackthorn, the lady of the house, watched everything unravel from the shadows. She noticed her husband's sudden softness, his absence from their bed, the way he lingered near the slave quarters at night as if drawn by a spell. She blamed witchcraft. She blamed curses. She blamed everything except the truth. Her husband had been conquered by something far older than desire, something that did not seek affection but dominance. Margaret confronted him one night, demanding that he sell the girl or suffer the consequences. Edward didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply stared back with the same vacant reverence he once reserved for God. But what chilled Margaret more than her husband's silence was the girl's expression when she looked at her. No hatred, no fear, no jealousy, just the quiet acknowledgement of a woman who already knew how the story would end. As weeks turned into months, the girl's influence spread through the estate like slow poison. Overseers became docile, workers moved more carefully, as if every wrong step might trigger her wrath. Even the animals acted strangely. Dogs whined and hid under porches when she passed. Chickens refused to lay eggs on nights when she didn't sleep. Horses paced in their stalls until dawn. And Edward, the once feared master, began deferring to her silently, unconsciously, as if he had forgotten he was the owner at all. The transformation reached its peak on a storm-heavy night when Edward collapsed in his study. Servants rushed in to find him on the floor, gasping her name. She stood over him without touching him, yet he writhed as if she were holding his heart in her hand. When the fit ended, he signed away control of the plantation to her. From that moment forward, she was no longer a slave. She was the mistress. But the true horror was not that she rose to power. It was that she had been waiting for that moment long before she ever arrived. They said her rise to power was unnatural, but what frightened them more was how easily the household surrendered to her. It didn't happen with force, nor with shouting, nor with the rebellion of chains breaking. It happened the way a forest is overtaken by creeping vines, silent, patient, inevitable. No one in Blackthorn Manor realized when they began obeying her without question. It was as though the very air had changed, thickening around her presence, pressing on the lungs of anyone who tried to resist. At first, it was subtle. A servant would pause mid-task when she walked by, waiting as if expecting instructions. An overseer would lower his whip when she looked at him, unable to lift it again until she was gone. Even Margaret, the plantation's rightful mistress, noticed her own hands trembling whenever the girl entered a room. It was not fear of violence, it was fear of surrendering, fear of losing oneself entirely. But the most chilling part was that she never demanded authority. People handed it to her with a kind of terrified devotion. Some whispered that she had a gift. Others said it was a curse. A few believed she carried the shadow of the ancestors, those who had suffered too long and finally decided to speak through her. Whatever the explanation, one truth remained: she became the axis around which the entire plantation rotated. Her silence became law, her presence became scripture. Her absence became a punishment more agonizing than any whip. It started with the children. The slave children, wild and reckless as they often were, gathered around her like moths drawn to a dark flame. They followed her footsteps, mimicked her posture, mirrored her expression. Mothers feared it at first, trying to pull their little ones back, but the children resisted with unexpected strength. They refused meals if she did not bless the food with a simple touch. They wouldn't sleep unless she stepped inside the quarters and whispered something none of the adults could understand. The more the children clung to her, the more the adults conceded. For on plantations like Blackthorn, children rarely survived long enough to attach themselves to anything. The fact that they flourished around her was treated as a sign, holy to some, unholy to others. Edward noticed it too. He watched from a distance as she walked through the fields surrounded by tiny shadows. He watched the way they reached for her, the way they touched her skirts, the way their laughter echoed in places that had been silent for years. Instead of jealousy, he felt pride that he alone had discovered this extraordinary, otherworldly creature. His obsession deepened. He stopped interacting with the older slaves entirely, choosing instead to follow her wherever she went. Margaret, already unraveling by her husband's betrayal, could not understand the power this girl held over everyone. The estate she once ruled with iron discipline now pulsed with a law she did not recognize, a law she could not break even with all her authority. The girl walked as though she had done this before. She glided through the plantation with an unnerving confidence, pausing in places where cruel memories still lived. She stood beneath the hanging oak, a tree that had claimed too many lives, and closed her eyes as if listening to the whispers trapped within the bark. She visited the whipping post at night, sliding her fingers over the grooves carved by years of screams. Sometimes she knelt in the middle of the cane fields as though paying respect to a hidden grave. Every place that held sorrow seemed to acknowledge her, bowing beneath her touch, rising when she stood. It was not reverence from the land, it was recognition. As her influence deepened, strange things began to happen. The field overseer, a man who had once beaten slaves until his knuckles cracked, fell gravely ill without warning. He claimed he saw her standing in the corner of his cabin at night, watching silently as his chest tightened and breath left his lungs. He begged the master for forgiveness. He begged to be moved away from Blackthorn. Edward refused, not out of cruelty but because he feared upsetting the girl. The overseer died within days, and from that moment on, no one ever raised a whip on the plantation again. Another incident followed when the head cook woke screaming in the middle of the night, insisting she had seen the girl's shadow hovering over her in her sleep. She claimed that the shadow reached into her mouth and pulled something out, a sin, a secret, or a sickness, she could not say. But from that morning, she never spoke ill of anyone again. Her bitterness evaporated, leaving her quiet and trembling. She worked without complaint, her eyes avoiding the girl's gaze, her voice too soft to criticize even the smallest mistake. Some said the girl had taken her hatred. Others believed she had taken her soul. As more strange occurrences piled up, the slaves started treating the girl not as one of them, but as something far above them. They left offerings at her door, bundles of herbs, scraps of food, beads woven from dried grass, carved wooden figures. No one taught them to do it. The idea simply arose, spreading through the quarters like instinct. They prayed near her window. They asked her silently to protect their children. They begged her to keep death away. Whether she heard their pleas or ignored them, no one knew. But the plantation's atmosphere changed. Storms skirted around Blackthorn. Crops thrived in seasons they usually failed. Wolves remained at the edge of the forest, never daring to cross the boundary. Margaret watched all of this with horror growing in her chest like a slow flame. It wasn't that the girl took her husband's loyalty. It was that the girl took her power, her control over the slaves, the house, the land. Margaret had built her entire life on dominance, and now she found herself overshadowed by someone who had never asked for a single thing the girl didn't need to speak to claim authority. The entire plantation gave it to her willingly. Eventually, Margaret admitted the truth she had avoided. This girl wasn't rising to power. She had come with power already burning inside her, waiting for the right soil to take root. Blackthorn was merely the place where it blossomed, and everyone, slave, master, and mistress, felt the shift in their bones they could no longer deny. The strangest change came not from the slaves, nor from the land, nor even from Edward's growing obsession, but from the house itself. Blackthorn Manor had always been a place built on power, cold, rigid, merciless power. Its walls had heard the cries of the punished, its floors had soaked in the blood of the desperate, and its windows had watched generations of suffering with indifference. But after the girl became mistress in everything but name, the house began behaving like a living creature adjusting to a new ruler. Doors that once creaked defiantly now opened smoothly as she approached. The old staircase, known for swallowing footsteps into hollow echoes, fell silent under her weight. The chandeliers steadied themselves when she entered a room, as if even the flames feared offending her. Margaret was the first to notice the changes. She would walk through the halls at night and feel the temperature shift sharply the moment she turned a corner, cold where the girl had just been, warm where she lingered for long periods. The house had always made Margaret feel powerful. Now it made her feel unwelcome, as though she were trespassing in her own domain. Even her bedroom, once a sanctuary, betrayed her. Candles refused to stay lit. The fireplace crackled weakly. Her reflection in the mirror seemed paler each day. She blamed illness, age, the stress of managing a collapsing household, but deep down she knew the truth. The house no longer answered to her. The slaves felt this shift too. They whispered that the house had chosen a new mistress, that the walls themselves bent toward the girl like branches toward the sun. Some touched the bricks softly as they passed, murmuring prayers of thanks, believing the house had finally softened after decades of cruelty. But others felt more cautious, sensing that the change was not mercy, it was allegiance. Blackthorn had accepted the girl, not because she was kind or gentle, but because she belonged to something older and stronger than any human authority. Strange noises resurfaced in the manor after years of silence, soft tapping behind walls, faint humming in the hallways, doors unlocking without a touch. Yet these occurrences only happened when Margaret or Edward were near. When the girl walked those same halls, all was still. It was as though the house bowed its head in her presence, waiting for instruction. One night, Edward followed her quietly as she walked through the manor. He didn't know if she heard him or chose to ignore him, but she never turned around. She drifted through the corridors at a slow, steady pace, pausing at rooms she had never entered before, looking at them with the familiarity of someone returning home after years away. She stopped at the old prayer room, a space Margaret had sealed off after losing her infants, believing the room cursed. The girl pressed her palm against the locked door. Without a single sound, the lock twisted itself open. Edward froze when he saw it, yet she simply continued inside, her steps soft against the rotting carpet. Inside that forgotten room, she knelt before the discarded cross on the floor. Edward stood trembling in the doorway, unsure whether he was witnessing devotion or defiance. When she finally stood, the cross lay upright, balanced perfectly on its base, though no human hands had touched it. Edward felt the air thicken around him, and he knew he should run, call for help, do something, but he couldn't move. He watched her walk past him like a ghost passing through a stunned witness, and he realized he was no longer the master of anything here, not the estate, not the house, and certainly not her. Margaret, meanwhile, was fighting a war inside her own mind. She felt the house watching her. She felt its resentment, its disappointment, its shifting loyalties. She tried to regain control the only way she knew, through cruelty. She stormed through the quarters, ordering punishments, demanding obedience, hoping to remind everyone who the true mistress was. But every command she gave dissolved in the air. The slaves listened politely, but their eyes remained cold, distant, aligned with someone else. Even the overseers ignored her, pretending not to hear, too frightened of the girl's unseen power to side with Margaret. The humiliation consumed her. She found herself hiding in her own rooms, terrified of passing the girl in the hallway. Each time they crossed paths, Margaret felt a sudden paralysis, a weight pressing down on her chest, a buzzing in her ears, a sense that the girl's gaze saw something inside Margaret she didn't want revealed. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't vengeance. It was worse. It was indifference. The girl didn't see Margaret as a threat, an obstacle, or even a rival. She saw her as irrelevant. Margaret's breaking point came the evening she heard soft singing drifting down the hallway. It was a language she didn't recognize, old, rhythmic, haunting. She followed the sound, her hands shaking, until she reached the parlor. Through the doorway, she saw the girl sitting before the fireplace, surrounded by slave women who listened with tears in their eyes. The flames crackled higher with every note she sang, rising unnaturally tall, dancing like they understood her song. When Margaret stepped closer, the flames suddenly shrank into a small, harmless glow. Every woman in the room turned to look at Margaret, and Margaret felt something she had never experienced in that house. She was the outsider now. She fled before the humiliation burned her alive. But the most terrifying moment came days later, when the house took its allegiance a step further. Margaret woke gasping, feeling hands around her throat. She clawed at her skin, kicking and choking, but when she opened her eyes, no one was there. The pressure eased only when she heard soft footsteps passing her door, the girl walking quietly down the hall. As soon as she moved farther away, Margaret could breathe again. That morning, Margaret packed her belongings, convinced she would leave Blackthorn forever. But when she reached the front door, it refused to open. The latch jammed, the hinges locked. She pulled and pulled until her fingers bled, but the door remained sealed shut. Only when the girl walked into the foyer, casting her calm gaze over Margaret's trembling form, did the door unlock with a soft click. Margaret understood then that the house had made its decision. She was no longer mistress here, and she never would be again. Rumors spread fastest in places where suffering is constant, and at Blackthorn, whispers clung to the air like the scent of burning cane. Stories about the girl multiplied, shifting shape with every tongue that carried them. Some claimed she had been born under an eclipse, marked at birth by shadows. Others believed she had been raised by an old conjure woman deep in the swamps, fed on secrets and trained to command spirits that obeyed no earthly law. A few insisted she had died once, or perhaps many times, and had returned each time stronger, carrying pieces of the other world inside her. But the most unsettling rumor was the one no one wanted to repeat aloud, that she was not a victim of Blackthorn's cruelty but its collector. The ancestors, the dead, the wronged, the forgotten, it was said they walked with her, spoke through her, and demanded things no living person could understand. These rumors took on a life of their own, shaping the plantation's nights into something haunted. Workers claimed they saw her standing in the fields at dawn, barefoot in the wet grass, speaking softly into the empty air as if answering someone they couldn't see. Others swore they heard footsteps behind them when she wasn't there, felt cold fingers on their shoulders, smelled unfamiliar herbs burning long after midnight. Lights moved through the slave cabins on nights she didn't sleep. Flickering shapes drifting like restless spirits called to her side. Every whisper, every half-believed tale, every trembling suspicion only fed the mystery surrounding her. And the more the rumors grew, the more Edward fell deeper into her spell. He clung to the stories. He wanted to believe she was extraordinary. He wanted to be the man chosen by something divine or something dark. He didn't care which. He watched her obsessively, convinced he alone understood her. Whenever she passed, he rose without thinking. When she sat, he sat. When she walked outside at night, he followed from a distance, desperate to interpret every movement, every breath, every glance. It wasn't love. It wasn't lust. It was devotion twisted into madness. Edward stopped tending to his business affairs entirely. He ignored letters, debts, harvest schedules. He stopped speaking to Margaret except when necessary, and even then his words dripped with irritation. He grew impatient, manic, fragile. He could not sleep, claiming he felt her presence walking through his dreams, calling him forward with a look he could never reach. When she disappeared into the woods for hours at a time, he became delirious with fear, imagining she had left him forever. When she returned, calm and quiet as always, he broke into tears like a child. The slaves watched, horrified, unable to comprehend how the most feared master in the region had turned into a man begging for the attention of a girl he once purchased like cattle. Margaret, witnessing Edward's decay, grew convinced that the girl was killing him slowly, not with poison or touch, but with something far more powerful. She believed Edward had tethered himself to forces far beyond comprehension, and that the girl held the other end of the rope. The more he worshipped her, the more his soul thinned. His eyes grew hollow, his hands shook when he reached for her. He barely ate, barely spoke, barely existed unless she was near. But the most disturbing part was this: she refused to look at him. Not in cruelty, not in disdain, simply because he did not matter to her. This realization crushed Edward more violently than any physical blow. He had given her everything, his house, his authority, his life, and she offered nothing in return. She didn't resist him. She didn't encourage him. She didn't acknowledge him at all. He was a ghost orbiting a sun that didn't even know he existed. The slaves noticed something else too. Edward's shadow no longer matched his body. On several occasions, workers claimed they saw his shadow moving a moment too late, or turning in the wrong direction. One man swore he saw Edward's shadow linger behind after the master had walked away, stretching unnaturally long across the floor before evaporating. When he confessed this to the girl, she simply stared at him, and the man collapsed to his knees, shaking uncontrollably. People began saying that Edward was losing more than his mind, that the girl was draining the life from him, piece by piece, without ever touching him. Margaret's terror hardened into fury. She confronted Edward one evening, demanding that he banish the girl from the estate. She accused him of tearing their family apart, destroying the plantation, and humiliating her in front of the entire household. But Edward, exhausted and trembling, could barely muster a response. He stared through her, as if he could see the girl's reflection shining behind Margaret's outline. Margaret slapped him. Hard. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Edward's eyes snapped back into focus, but not with anger, with fear, because the girl had appeared in the doorway, silent as death, watching them both. Margaret felt something twist inside her chest the moment their eyes met. She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't move. She felt invisible hands tightening around her throat again, stronger than before, until tears streamed down her face. The girl blinked once, the pressure vanished. Margaret collapsed to the floor, coughing violently. Edward rushed toward the girl, not Margaret, babbling incoherently, begging her forgiveness for something he hadn't even done. But the girl simply turned and walked away, uninterested in him, uninterested in Margaret, uninterested in the chaos she created simply by existing. That night, the rumors changed. No one said she was cursed anymore. They said she was chosen, and that Blackthorn Plantation was nothing more than the stage upon which her destiny was unfolding, piece by piece, life by life, with a power no one dared challenge anymore. There are nights that rewrite the fate of a land, nights when the earth trembles without moving, when the air thickens as if holding its breath, and when a single woman crossing a threshold changes the lineage of a family older than the soil beneath it. For the abominable slave, whom the Low Country whispered about as if speaking her name invited spirits, this night was the one that revealed her true power. It was the night she stepped not as a servant into the plantation house, but as something far more dangerous, the mistress. The transformation did not begin with defiance. It began with obedience, the kind that cloaked rebellion like cotton cloaks the blade of a hidden knife. She knew the owner's weaknesses, the loneliness in his eyes, the tremor in his hands, the guilt he never confessed about the empire he ran on broken backs and bondage. She had watched him for years, how he drank more with each season, how he talked to portraits of long-gone ancestors as if they condemned him, how he walked the halls at night whispering prayers he never dared to say aloud in daylight. But she also knew the house. She studied its heartbeat the way a doctor studies a dying patient's pulse, the collapsing beams, the hidden passage behind the pantry, the loose floorboard in the master's study that concealed correspondence, never meant to be read by enslaved eyes. She knew which doors creaked, which didn't, which windows carried sound, and which corridors swallowed it whole. A house that ancient was a living thing, and she alone understood how to navigate its lungs and veins. On that night, the master summoned her not as property, but as counsel, though he would never have admitted it. He sat in his chair, face pale, sweat beading on his brow, hands shaking as though the ghosts of his ancestors had tightened an invisible rope around his throat. He told her of threats from neighboring planters, of debts hidden behind false ledgers, of a marriage contract forced upon him by a wealthy widow he no longer loved. His world, once impenetrable, was collapsing, and she listened, not with fear, not with pity, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew she would one day claim ownership of more than her own survival. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, rich, and commanding, so unlike what society believed a slave's voice should be that the master found himself obeying it without thought. She explained how he could dissolve the pressured engagement, how he could secure protection through alliances he had overlooked, how he could restructure his indebted fields, and how he could keep the overseers in check without revealing his weakness. She laid out a strategy wiser than any offered by his advisors, sharper than any counsel of neighboring families. And for the first time in his life, the master realized the horrifying and exhilarating truth. She was smarter than him, braver than him, and far more fit to rule than him. He felt it, she knew he did. But the night did not end with plans. It ended with a shift of power so profound the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. She stood, walked to the heavy velvet curtains and pulled them closed. The room dimmed into lamplight. The air grew dense. She approached him, not seduction, not hesitation, but dominion. Her presence was a storm gathering its final winds. She told him the truth he had always sensed, that she was no ordinary woman, that the blood of queens and warriors, though enslaved by chains, still flowed in her veins, and that a force older than the plantation itself had chosen her path. Then she placed her hand on the armrest of his chair, not a touch of affection, a declaration. Her hand rested there with the unmistakable authority of ownership, and the master did not pull away. Instead, he bowed his head, not in fear, but in surrender. From that moment, the dynamic shifted. Servants watching through cracks in doors saw it. The overseer felt it like a curse humming beneath the floorboards. Even the house seemed to adjust itself, its silence changing tone, as though the spirit of the estate recognized its new ruler. She walked through the upstairs hallway that night, not behind the master, but beside him. She spoke to him with directness no enslaved woman would dare. She inspected the rooms, giving instructions about their upkeep. She asked questions about finances, land boundaries, and political alliances. She examined the family portraits as if auditing a legacy she intended to inherit. He did not object, because somewhere inside him, he understood that she had already surpassed him. He could either resist and crumble, or follow and survive. By morning, the transformation was complete. The enslaved workers watched as the master emerged from the front door looking strangely relieved, head bowed, shoulders loose, as though a burden had been lifted, not by freedom, but by submission. And behind him she appeared, not in rags, not barefoot, but in a dark tailored dress she had selected from the mistress's old wardrobe, a garment that fit her body and her power in a way it had never suited the woman it originally belonged to. She stepped onto the porch not as a slave, not yet as a free woman, but as something far more unsettling to the world of plantations, a slave who had become the mistress, a woman who commanded the land with the silent strength of those who have survived every cruelty and still rise higher, a force no hierarchy could explain or stop. That day the winds across the fields shifted, birds fell silent, and every enslaved worker whispered the same phrase to one another. She took the house last night. They said it with awe, with fear, with hope, because once a woman like her seized power, there was no turning back. The plantation had a new ruler, one the world was not prepared to face, and she had only just begun. Power, when newly claimed, invites enemies like rot invites flies, and on a plantation where the rules were carved into bone and blood, nothing enraged the old order more than seeing a slave woman walk with the confidence of the mistress. The first to rise against her, brutal, predictable, hungry for violence, was the overseer. He was a man molded by cruelty. His father had whipped men until their backs looked like maps of rivers etched in raised scars. His grandfather had been the type who boasted about how many slaves he had broken before breakfast. Violence was not just in his lineage, it was his inheritance, his religion, and his weapon. For years, the overseer believed he was the true spine of the plantation, more influential than even the master. When he saw the abominable slave step into authority, he felt something ancient and ugly ignite in him: panic. Because panic is what hatred really is, fear disguised as fury. He watched her from shadows, from verandas, from the edge of fields. He saw the way the master lowered his head when she spoke. He noticed how field workers stood taller when she passed, and when she began changing routines, reducing punishments, altering work schedules, protecting the vulnerable, the overseer understood the terrifying truth. She was dismantling his power without ever touching a weapon. For men like him, loss of authority was worse than death. So he planned. He whispered to the other overseers, stirred resentment in the kitchen staff, and pitted the master's distant relatives against her. He spread rumors that she had bewitched the house, that she practiced dark rituals at night, that she carried a curse that would destroy the land. But none of that worked. The more he tried to weaken her, the more the master relied on her counsel. So he escalated. One night he followed her as she walked toward the smokehouse to inspect inventory. She sensed his presence long before he revealed himself. The night was moonless, and the trees overhead creaked like old men warning of danger. She entered the smokehouse, already knowing he would corner her. She stood in the center of the room, back straight, hands relaxed at her sides, not in fear, but in expectation. The overseer stepped into the doorway, blocking the exit. His boots thudded against the wooden floor like someone preparing to trample a creature smaller than himself. He didn't bother hiding his intent. Violence was the only language he spoke fluently. "You forget your place," he growled, his voice low and thick with rage. She didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him the way storm clouds look at a dry field, knowing they will drown what stands in their path. "My place," she replied calmly, "is wherever I choose to stand." Her words hit him like a slap. Hatred surged in him. His face twisted. He moved closer, invading her space, whispering threats meant to break her spirit. He bragged of what he'd done to others. Men, women, children. He described in disgusting detail the violence he intended to inflict. But the more he spoke, the quieter the room felt. The flames from the lantern flickered as if shrinking back from the malice in his voice. The air thickened. Even the shadows seemed to hesitate. Then she did something that terrified him more than any rebellion ever could. She smiled, not mockingly, not sweetly, but with the chilling calm of someone who had already survived the worst kind of cruelty decades before this man ever learned to wield a whip. It was the smile of a woman who carried a power the overseer could never comprehend, a power carved from pain, sharpened by endurance, and crowned by destiny. "You cannot break what was never yours," she murmured. The overseer lunged, but the moment he reached for her, something shifted in the air. Whether it was supernatural, psychological, or simply the natural reaction of a predator misjudging its prey, no one would ever be certain. All that is known is this: he did not touch her. Instead, he stumbled backward, struck by a force he could not explain, a force that felt like hands pushing him though none were visible. He crashed into the wall, lantern shaking, his breath knocked out. His face paled, eyes widening as he stared at her. "What are you?" he whispered, and she stepped forward, her shadow stretching long and dark behind her. "I am the rightful mistress of this house," she answered, "and you will never raise your hand to me again." Her voice held no anger. It held authority, pure, unshakable, immovable authority. The overseer scrambled to his feet and fled the smokehouse like a haunted man, tripping over crates, gasping, barely able to breathe. He didn't sleep that night, or any night after that. Something inside him had shattered, something deeper than pride. By morning, he resigned. He packed his belongings with trembling hands and left without demanding wages. The plantation workers watched silently as he rode off, his posture hunched, his eyes hollow. Word spread through the fields like wildfire. She drove the overseer out. Some said she cursed him. Others said she possessed spirits. But the truth was more dangerous than folklore. She had confronted a monster and made him fear her. The master, when he learned what happened, did not question her. Instead, he quietly ordered she be protected at all times. He replaced the overseer with a milder, more fearful man, someone too intimidated to challenge her authority. And just like that, her position solidified. No one, not the workers, not the house staff, not the extended family, could deny what they had witnessed. A slave woman had overpowered the most brutal man on the plantation without lifting a single hand against him. Power had shifted permanently, and the plantation would never recover from that night. For years, the mistress of the plantation had been away, traveling between her sister's estate, distant relatives, and medical retreats that promised cures for her fainting spells and melancholic episodes. Everyone whispered she had grown fragile, delicate, too breakable for plantation life. The truth was far simpler and far crueler. She was tired of her husband, tired of the plantation's rot, tired of pretending her marriage still meant anything. Her absence was an escape disguised as illness, but no escape lasts forever. One autumn morning, under a sky the color of weak tea, her carriage rolled into the yard. The air was heavy with the sweet rot of fallen leaves, and the horses snorted clouds of mist as they slowed. Workers paused mid-task, heads turning, eyes widening. Some exchanged glances. Others kept staring toward the big house, waiting for the inevitable collision of worlds. Because everyone knew one thing: the mistress had left a plantation, and she was returning to a kingdom already claimed by another woman. When she stepped out of the carriage, she carried herself with the porcelain elegance of an aristocrat, back straight, chin lifted, gloved fingers adjusting her traveling cloak. Her eyes scanned the yard, noting small changes, new patterns in the gardens, altered routines, the subtle but unmistakable shift in how the workers held themselves. And then she saw the abominable slave, standing at the veranda steps, not as a servant, not as a background figure, but as a woman who belonged there. She wore a plain dress, but she wore it with authority. Her posture held quiet ownership. Her gaze was steady and unafraid. She did not curtsy. She did not step aside. She simply watched the mistress with a calm that bordered on regal. That was the first spark of fury. The mistress's eyes narrowed. She felt something cold scrape down her spine, a mixture of shock, insult, and the sting of betrayal she had long claimed she no longer felt. She had expected decay, disorder, maybe even the plantation falling apart without her. But she had not expected this. A slave standing where she used to stand. Inside the house, the tension thickened like smoke. Servants moved nervously. Workers kept their distance. Even the walls seemed to lean in, waiting for the eruption. For the first few minutes, the mistress spoke with stiff politeness, cold greetings, clipped questions, formal inquiries, until she finally asked the question that had been tightening in her chest. "Where," she said sharply, "is my husband?" No one answered, because everyone knew exactly where he was. And when he finally appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression sealed the truth. No one dared speak aloud. His eyes flickered nervously between his wife and the woman beside him. His posture betrayed guilt, hesitation, and a quiet preference he could not hide no matter how he straightened his shoulders. The mistress saw everything. When her gaze fell on the abominable slave again, she understood the entire story, the shift in routines, the new atmosphere, the overseer's sudden departure, the silent respect the workers showed her. It all took shape in an instant, as clear as a slap. This woman had become the mistress of the house. Rage swelled inside her, hot and choking, but years of aristocratic upbringing held it beneath the surface. She did not scream, though she wanted to. She did not slap the master, though her hands trembled. Instead, she walked with rigid dignity into the parlor and demanded a private conversation. Behind closed doors, her voice, usually soft, cracked like a whip. "How dare you," she hissed. "How dare you turn my home into this mockery?" The master, cowardly as ever, stumbled through excuses. She had been gone too long. The plantation needed someone to manage it. She was unwell. He had no choice. Lies, all of them. Thin, desperate lies. She asked the question both dreaded. "Is she your lover?" He looked away, and silence became confession. When the mistress emerged from the room, her face was pale, but her rage had crystallized into something sharper and more dangerous than anger, intent. She sought out the abominable slave, who stood in the hallway with quiet patience, as if she knew this confrontation was inevitable. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the house felt too small to hold the two of them. "You think you can take my place," the mistress said bitterly. The abominable slave did not flinch. "I have taken nothing. I only stood where he asked me to stand." It was not defiance, it was truth. And that truth hurt more than any insult could. The mistress stepped closer, lowering her voice until it was a blade coated in honey. "Do you know what happens to women like you who step above their station?" The abominable slave did not look away. "Do you know what happens to women like you who try to push them back?" The air cracked between them. Two women, both claiming the same crown, one by law, one by circumstance, destiny, and undeniable presence. The plantation itself seemed to pulse with the tension. In the following days, the mistress tried everything to reclaim control. She reorganized rooms, reassigned duties, issued new rules with icy precision. She hovered over workers, questioned every choice, forced the master to attend dinners and gatherings that had long fallen out of habit. She tried to restore her old authority by sheer force of will, but authority built on fear is fragile, and the workers no longer feared her. Their loyalty, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, had shifted to the abominable slave, whose leadership was firm but fair. She brought order without cruelty, efficiency without violence. For the first time in the plantation's history, small acts of humanity existed within its routine. No amount of aristocratic rage could compete with that. The mistress watched helplessly as the truth became impossible to deny. She had returned to a house that no longer belonged to her, and the woman she sought to destroy had already become the queen she could never be. When a powerless woman gains power, the world looks for a supernatural excuse. It wasn't long before the plantation and the entire county beyond it began murmuring about the abominable slave's rise. At first, the whispers were small, nervous, half-formed. A kitchen maid claimed she saw candlelight moving under the slave woman's door at odd hours. A field hand muttered that he heard chanting behind the smokehouse. A stable boy swore she spoke to the horses and they listened. None of it was true, but the truth did not matter, because the mistress, threatened, humiliated, and desperate, began feeding those whispers with subtle, calculated precision. She invited the pastor for tea. She confided in neighboring wives. She murmured words like unnatural and bewitching and sinful influence. She let tears fall where they would be noticed. She let her voice tremble where it would echo. And the county listened. People always listen when the accusation is witchcraft, because fear is easier to believe than change. Within weeks, the rumors grew teeth. Workers prayed more loudly. Mothers made the sign of the cross when the abominable slave walked past. Men who once admired her strength now questioned it. Even the master, though he still clung to her presence like a drowning man to driftwood, looked more troubled each time she entered a room. Fear had seeped into the walls, But what fueled the hysteria most was not rumor, nor jealousy, nor superstition. It was timing. A strange series of natural misfortunes struck the plantation that month. A storm tore shingles from the slave quarters. A fever spread among the cattle. The well water turned cloudy after heavy rains. These were ordinary troubles, familiar to anyone who worked the land. Yet the county interpreted each one as evidence. God is punishing the plantation, they whispered. The slave woman has brought a curse. She has bewitched the master and stolen the house. By the time the mistress added her own trembling voice to the growing storm, the narrative was already carved in stone. The abominable slave became a symbol of something larger: fear of change, fear of rebellion, fear of an enslaved woman wielding authority she was never meant to hold. Even the children whispered her name. Their voices, high and frightened, echoed through corridors thick with dust and secrets. Yet through all of this she moved with the same quiet, dignified strength that had carried her through a lifetime of brutality. She rose each morning before dawn. She oversaw meals. She checked inventories. She protected the workers from excess punishments. She managed the ledgers with a precision the master had never possessed. She did not lash out. She did not crumble. She endured, and that endurance only deepened the shadows of fear around her. One evening, as twilight drained the world into shades of gray, she walked across the yard to inspect a broken fence. A group of field hands paused at her approach. These were men she had helped, men whose punishments she had reduced, whose families she had protected, whose children she had quietly ensured were fed. Yet now, they stepped back from her as though her shadow burned. One of them whispered, "Mistress says she ain't natural." She didn't reply. She simply looked at them, really looked. And in their eyes she saw something that wounded deeper than any whip ever had: distance, fear, the beginnings of betrayal. She understood then that power does not make one safe, it only makes one visible. Later that same night, as the plantation slept in uneasy silence, she felt the shift in the air, like something cold pressing against the windows, like a storm preparing to break. The mistress had been busy that day, meeting with neighbors, exchanging letters, sending the stable boy galloping toward the churchyard. A confrontation was coming, and the abominable slave knew it. But she also knew something the mistress did not. A woman who survives the unspeakable does not fear being spoken about. She had lived through hunger, chains, assaults, and the slow erosion of hope. Rumors were nothing. Fear was a fog she could walk through. Still, she felt the weight of the coming battle, because this was no longer about jealousy or power, it was about survival. The mistress, fueled by humiliation and righteous fury, had found her weapon, the county's fear of witchcraft. And with that weapon, she was gathering allies, wives who despised their own reflections, men threatened by the mere idea of a slave woman standing tall, preachers eager to purge what they did not understand. They gathered like vultures circling a dying animal. Whispers thickened into accusations, accusations sharpened into plans, plans darkened into intent. The master sensed danger but said nothing. His weakness, always his greatest flaw, became the tinder fueling the growing blaze. He tried to keep peace. He tried to calm his wife. He tried to reassure the abominable slave. But each attempt failed because a man without courage cannot hold two worlds together. The plantation was splitting down the middle. Those who admired her stood silently, afraid to defend her. Those who feared her grew bolder, sharpened by the mistress's venom. Even the night seemed to hold its breath, as though the land itself knew something terrible was being born. And yet, in the heart of all this chaos, the abominable slave did something unexpected. She began to prepare, not for a fight, not for flight, but for revelation. She knew the county would come for her. She knew the mistress had roused old laws against new threats. She knew the church would demand judgment. But she also knew something they did not. Her power did not lie in magic or fear or superstition. Her power lay in truth, and truth, when revealed at the right moment, can shatter entire worlds. The mistress believed she would destroy the slave woman with whispers of witchcraft. What she did not know was that she had awakened something far more dangerous, a woman who had nothing left to fear. The night the child was born, the storm tore across the plantation with a ferocity no one had seen in decades. Rain lashed against the roof, wind bent the trees until their roots seemed to groan, and the sky itself split open with the sudden crack of lightning. Inside the manor, candles flickered and died, throwing shadows that danced across walls painted with years of fear, oppression, and secrets. The abominable slave moved through the halls with the calm certainty of someone who had lived every horror imaginable, though nothing prepared her for the night she had carried the child alone, without midwives, without the comfort of even her own bed. The master, Edward, watched from the parlor, torn between fascination and terror. He had never seen her so human and yet so untouchable. The mistress of the house, the one who had returned to reclaim her authority, stayed in the background, wringing her hands, her face pale with dread. She could not comprehend that the abominable slave was not only enduring the birth, but commanding the very energy of the house and storm around her. As the labor progressed, the candles fell one by one, extinguished by invisible currents. Doors opened and closed, slammed or shivered against walls with no discernible cause. Servants and field workers huddled in corners, fearful of seeing or hearing something that might reveal the true nature of the girl's power. Each scream, each cry of the mother echoed through the halls like a tolling bell, shaking the very foundations of Blackthorn Manor. The birth was long and violent. No midwife's hands guided her. No priest's blessing interrupted the storm. She was alone in her strength, alone in her endurance, and the child fought as fiercely as she did to enter the world. Every scream seemed to pierce the veil between the living and the dead, calling ancestors from their graves, calling spirits long chained to the plantation to witness the miracle and the horror simultaneously. Finally, when the child emerged, the first sound was its cry, a raw, primal wail that seemed to roll through the walls and echo down the long corridors. It carried authority, presence, and a peculiar sense of ancient knowing. Workers who heard it later swore they felt the air itself bend toward the newborn, as though the manor and the fields recognized the arrival of someone extraordinary, someone unbound by the cruelty or rules of the world. The master fell to his knees. He wept silently, unsure whether it was joy, fear, or awe that overcame him. The mistress, conflicted, jealous, and still clinging to the remnants of her former authority, stood rigid, her hands trembling, heart pounding, sensing the final collapse of the power she had once assumed was hers alone. She looked at the abominable slave with an understanding that would haunt her. The child was a symbol of a shift she could not undo, yet no one dared interfere, no one could. Not because they were loyal, not because they revered the abominable slave, but because some part of them understood that power of this magnitude was untouchable. To move, to act, to raise a hand against her or the child was to court destruction, not just physical but spiritual. The storm outside reached its zenith, lightning cracking in patterns that illuminated the sleeping fields and barns. The rain hammered the roof, and somewhere, perhaps beyond the manor, the wind carried the whispers of ancestors. Acknowledging the birth as something sacred and terrifying, the abominable slave, bloodied and exhausted, cradled the child in her arms. She whispered words no one else heard, soft incantations, promises, and warnings. It was clear to anyone who dared look, the child was not merely born of flesh and survival. The child was born of endurance, wrath, and a will older than any law that had ever bound the plantation. Servants whispered that the abominable slave herself had become a vessel for something larger than human authority. They said the candles had not fallen by accident, that the doors had moved on their own, that the storm had answered her cries. Some wept, some hid, and some, braver or more foolish than the rest, dared to approach to touch the newborn. Their hands trembled. They swore the child's presence burned through their palms, leaving warmth that was not comfort but power. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a blackened sky with streaks of gold. The fields were soaked, the manor damp, and the air thick with the scent of rain and earth. The master and the mistress, along with the surviving household, emerged into the light to see the world changed. They knew instinctively that nothing would ever be the same. The child, held firmly in the arms of the abominable slave, had altered the balance of Blackthorn Manor irrevocably. Neighbors, hearing of the tumultuous birth, came with curiosity and fear. They expected chaos, a disaster, perhaps death. Instead, they found a calm authority, a control born of a mother who had survived every horror imaginable, and a child whose cries carried the weight of generations. People whispered, mouths half covered, that the plantation had witnessed something miraculous and terrifying at once. They spoke of the abominable slave as one who had forced the impossible to bow to her will, and of the child as a harbinger of a new era, one that might defy every law of the living and the dead. Even decades later, townspeople claimed that the child's cry could still be heard echoing in the halls during storms. They said that the abominable slave, now mistress in every sense of the word, walked through her domain with an authority that made men shrink and women tremble. The child had grown under her care, inheriting the aura of power that could bend hearts, break chains, and command obedience without a word. Blackthorn Manor, once a house of terror and cruelty, had transformed into a monument to endurance, fear, and a kind of authority that bordered on the supernatural. That night, the night of the birth, was remembered in whispers, letters, and secret journals. It was the moment when the abominable slave had fully claimed her place, when the child had stepped into a world that would never accommodate weakness, and when the plantation itself had acknowledged a power that no mortal law could control. People spoke of the birth as a turning point, a storm both literal and symbolic, a night that forever altered the fates of everyone who had the misfortune or privilege of witnessing it. The legend of that stormy birth endured not because of superstition alone, but because it marked the absolute domination of one who had once been powerless, and the emergence of a new force in the lineage of Blackthorn Manor. Every scream, every crash of lightning, every candle that fell and was replaced by silence, testified to one immutable truth. The abominable slave had given birth not just to a child, but to a revolution that would echo through generations, whispered by those who dared to remember. The child, born amid storms and shadows, grew into a figure of whispered legends. By the time decades had passed, the townspeople had forgotten many details of the events at Blackthorn Manor, but no one forgot the presence of the abominable slave and the child she had raised. Even in the absence of written records or formal histories, memory preserved her story, cloaked in fear, awe, and reverence. The child's existence became a matter of rumor, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some said the child could speak to animals, that horses bowed at their approach, that birds followed like shadowed messengers through the air. Others claimed that the child carried the power of the storm itself, that even the weather bent to their will in subtle ways. Sudden winds, lightning strikes, or unnaturally calm nights seemed to signal the child's moods or intentions. Mothers told their children not to venture near the manor, warning that even glimpsing the child could alter their fate. The abominable slave, now fully recognized as the mistress, protected the child fiercely. No outsider, no servant, and no family member dared challenge her. The plantation had been transformed under her guidance. Cruelty was not eliminated, for the world would not allow it, but it was restrained, disciplined, and reshaped by her iron hand and sharp intellect. She had learned over decades that survival required more than power. It demanded cunning, patience, and the ability to anticipate threats before they arose. Despite the child's protection, fear persisted. Tales of the child's supernatural abilities spread beyond the county, reaching neighboring plantations and towns. Traders passing through whispered warnings to their peers. Travelers spoke of glimpses of the child in the windows at twilight, of shadows stretching unnaturally across the halls, of strange phenomena in the fields that seemed impossible to explain. Some who dared approach Blackthorn Manor claimed to feel an invisible weight, a presence that pressed down on their shoulders and forced them to speak or act in ways they would not otherwise. It was a presence that carried the authority of both the living and the dead, a power inherited from the abominable slave, honed through years of endurance and control. Even the master, Edward, remained bound to the house. He no longer ruled, no longer dared interfere. He existed in quiet compliance, his authority hollowed out by the realization that the abominable slave now commanded everything. He was a man who had once believed himself untouchable, now reduced to a witness of events he could neither influence nor fully comprehend. Margaret, the returning mistress, had long since left, her authority eroded by years of absence and by the undeniable rise of the woman who had taken her place. The legend of the child also served a practical purpose. The abominable slave used it as a shield. Rumors of supernatural abilities deterred the curious and the ambitious. No one wanted to test a power they could neither measure nor challenge. It created a buffer of fear around the child and the plantation itself, ensuring that the abominable slave's control remained unbroken. What the world perceived as magic or curse was in reality a strategic use of fear and perception, a testament to the intelligence and foresight of a woman who had survived every attempt to destroy her. As the child matured, townspeople claimed to witness events that defied logic. They said crops flourished in unusual patterns, that livestock moved as if anticipating commands, that illness and disease bypassed the estate's boundaries in inexplicable ways. Some believed the child had become a conduit for divine or supernatural intervention. Others whispered that the child had inherited the wrath and cunning of the abominable slave herself. Regardless of interpretation, the legend solidified: Blackthorn Manor had been altered forever, and no outsider would ever again control it as before. Within the walls of the manor, the abominable slave ensured the child was educated not only in survival and intellect, but also in the art of command. The child observed how authority was exercised, how fear could be measured, how loyalty could be earned or extracted. Every action of the adults around them, from workers to remaining family members, served as a lesson. By the time the child reached adulthood, they were no longer just the offspring of a slave. They were the heir to a legacy of power, cruelty, cunning, and resilience. They understood instinctively how to protect themselves, how to command without violence when possible, and when necessary, how to strike decisively against threats. Stories of their deeds spread through whispers and letters, reaching areas far beyond the plantation. Some claimed the child confronted intruders with the calm assurance of someone centuries old. Others swore that simply meeting the child's gaze instilled obedience or terror. These accounts, whether true or exaggerated, ensured that Blackthorn Manor remained untouched by outsiders. Its legend alone became a deterrent more effective than any physical fortification. Yet, as time passed, the abominable slave continued to teach, guide, and protect. She was aware that the child would eventually inherit the full weight of the plantation's authority, and she knew the world would test them ruthlessly. So she passed on not only knowledge of strategy and control, but also the lessons of endurance and psychological mastery that had allowed her to survive decades of brutality. The child learned how to navigate fear, harness loyalty, and turn superstition into a tool of influence. By the end of her life, the abominable slave had ensured that her legacy would endure. The child would be more than an heir. They would be a legend in their own right, bound to a power inherited not from birthright alone, but from the resilience, intelligence, and cunning of a woman who had defied every expectation and claimed authority from a world designed to deny it. The town continued to whisper about them long after, unsure whether they were blessed, cursed, or both. Even decades later, Blackthorn Manor remained a place of stories that blurred the line between history and myth. The abominable slave's child became a figure whose influence extended far beyond the plantation, a symbol of survival and power that no rumor, no superstition, and no adversary could erase. Their life proved that legends are not simply created. They are forged in blood, endurance, and unyielding determination, witnessed by those who dared to watch, whispered by those who dared not interfere, and remembered by a world that could not forget. The abominable slave, once powerless, had given birth to something eternal, a force that reshaped not only the plantation but the very notion of who could hold power in a world built to deny them. And through it, her story and the story of her child became immortal in the fearful reverence of everyone who had the misfortune or privilege of witnessing it.